We are living in extraordinary times, and such times require extraordinary measures. That much is uncontroversial. However, on the question of what measures to take, especially to resuscitate the Indian economy, controversy erupts. There is a distinguished group of people, which includes respected intellectuals and academics, revered business leaders, influential industry lobbies, celebrated media personalities, seasoned government bureaucrats, and the executive branch of the government of India. The responsible, serious gentlemen, and they are mostly men, who hold the fate of billions in their hands. They believe the way out of the wilderness is to recommit ourselves to the spirit of the economic reforms of 1991. So, they advocate for more concessions to the business community to improve the investment climate, for relaxation of regulations to speed up approvals for projects, for the repeal of archaic land acquisition and labor protection laws, for further opening up of agricultural markets and cutting down government intervention in the sector, for greater privatization of government-owned undertakings in banking, petroleum, telecom and other sectors, for even more commercialization of utilities like railways, electricity, education and healthcare, for tech-driven targeted welfare schemes for fiscal responsibility, and other things big business thinks government should do. By the way, it's not just the people at the top who believe that moving further in the direction of neoliberal reforms is the right thing. Almost everyone in the Indian middle class and above believes it, and they also have no doubt the neoliberal turn in 1991 was a glorious break from a dark socialist past. Everyone in your family who has an opinion on it believes it, your friends believe it, perhaps even you believe it, or used to when you were younger, as I did. And it's not really surprising why this belief is so popular, because on the surface, neoliberalism in India seems to be a remarkable success story. India's GDP in current US dollars has increased more than 10 times between 1991 and 2019. GDP per capita also in current US dollars has increased by nearly 7 times according to World Bank data. It can be surmised from these numbers that India has created a lot of wealth in the last 3 decades. And this stupendous wealth creation has led to huge gains for the upper classes, including most likely you, me, our families, friends, and co-workers. It is from the very same socio-economic background that virtually all managers and executors of public opinion are recruited. Members of our distinguished group, the journalists, intellectuals, business leaders, bureaucrats, politicians. The statistical evidence that suggests India is much better off since the neoliberal reforms is thus validated by the personal experiences of this entire group of people who have seen their wealth explode over the last 30 years, leading to near unanimity of public opinion and action on this issue. If any concern is expressed over the fact that a bulk of the wealth produced has gone into the hands of a very narrow section of the population, it is dismissed as a non-issue by the very same section of people. Income and wealth inequality do not really matter, the argument goes, as long as the poor are also getting richer, if only a little more slowly than the rich. The decrease in the number of people living below the poverty line in India today compared to 30 years ago is then offered as proof that the poor too are better off. It is only logical that if we continue down the same path, hopefully with greater vigor, soon we'll pull everyone above the poverty line, because as we all know, a rising tide lifts all boats. That's a great story, very persuasive and virtually unchallenged in popular discourse. There's this one problem. It's totally wrong. It's so wrong, it's almost like a fairy tale. I mean, where do we even start with that? I guess a good place to start would be the big lie at the heart of it. Let's talk about the poverty line. So how is the poverty line calculated in India? Well, in the late 70s, it was decided to adopt the nutritional norm method of measuring poverty. This method, suggested in a 1971 paper by V.M. Dandekar and N. Rath, seeks to correlate poverty with a minimum threshold of daily caloric intake. The idea being that the inability to access the nutritional standard required for relatively healthy growth of the body is a sure sign of acute poverty. This measure of poverty is obviously a partial measure. It looks at only a subset of the material deprivation a person experiences in terms of food. But poverty has other dimensions as well, like the psychological impact of living a life of constant insecurity and exclusion from recreation, education, and culture. Thus, the nutritional norm method doesn't give us the complete picture of poverty. At most, it is a very basic method of poverty estimation, not least because of the fact that just because a person is immediately above the minimum threshold doesn't mean their lives are much better than those immediately below it. Limited as this measure of poverty is, it was adopted by the Planning Commission in 1979 when it accepted the recommendations of a task force which worked out the required daily allowance, or RDA, for energy intake as 2400 calories per head per day for rural areas and 2100 calories per head per day for urban areas. The caloric requirements being based on recommendations of the Indian Council of Medical Research. Anyone who was unable to access this required daily allowance was to be considered poor. But how do we estimate how many people are unable to access the RDA? Well, it's not terribly difficult. The National Sample Survey Office conducts surveys across India in which it asks households detailed questions about their consumption of everything from all sorts of food items to fuel, utilities, durable goods, health, and education. Taking the prices of all the goods and services consumed by each household in a month, it is possible to calculate the total monthly expenditure of the household, which is then divided by the size of the household to give the per head expenditure, called the monthly per capita expenditure, or MPCE. By repeating the same exercise with every other household in the NSS sample, a distribution of individuals based on their MPCEs is obtained. The population is then divided into 12 groups or fractiles, with each group falling between two MPCE values and arranged in ascending order, with the first fractile denoting the bottom 5% of the population and the topmost denoting the top 5% of the population ranked by MPCE. If all that sounds a little confusing, let me make things easier, and I can't believe I'm saying this, by showing you a spreadsheet. This is the data based on the 50th round survey of the NSS that was carried out in 1993-94, immediately after the reforms. Right now, only the first four columns from the left concern us. The first column represents the particular fractile class, and the second the fractile range. The first fractile class, which is marked 0 to 5%, refers to the bottom 5% of the rural population ranked by MPCE, 5 to 10% to the next 5% of the rural population ranked by MPCE, and so on. In the next column, we see the MPCE range corresponding to each fractile. So anyone whose MPCE was less than 120 rupees in 93-94 fell in the bottom 5% of the rural population. Those whose monthly per head expenditure was between 120 and 140 rupees fell in the next 5% of the population, and so on. Given the MPCE range, it is possible to arrive at the average MPCE for each population group, which is given in the fourth column. If we turn to the fifth column, we see the average daily caloric intake per head of each population group. This value is also derived from the NSS consumption survey, because since the amount of food items consumed is known, as is the nutritional value of each food item, including the amount of calories per unit of a particular food item, it is possible to compute the per head per day caloric intake of a particular sample household. The average of the daily per head caloric intake of individuals in each fractile can thus be calculated, which is shown in the fifth column. All of this allows us to derive a relationship between the average monthly per head expenditure of a certain section of the population and the amount of calories that can be accessed daily at that observed level of expenditure. As our poverty standards are defined by a nutritional norm, anyone spending less than what it takes to attain the required daily allowance, which for rural areas is 2400 calories, would be classified as poor, and the average MPCE that is observed to attain the RDA would then be our poverty line. Trust me, the hard part is done. Now we can just look at the table and get an estimate of the number of people living in poverty as defined by the nutritional norm in rural areas in 93-94. Let's start with the ninth fractile. The average daily per head caloric intake of this group of people is 2410 calories, which can be considered equivalent to the RDA for rural areas. And the amount of monthly expenditure that is observed to access this amount of calories is 324.94 rupees, or rupees 325. Now, since the upper end MPCE value of the previous fractile is 300, and of all the preceding fractiles is even lesser, we can say that 70% of the population doesn't spend enough, that is 325 rupees, required to access the RDA of 2400 calories. Further, some people in the ninth fractile too have MPCs less than 325 because the MPC range lies between 300 and 355, and these people too are unable to access the RDA. So the total number of rural poor based on the survey would be between 70 and 80%. The actual value of the number of rural poor in this year based on this data has been calculated by the economist Utsa Patnaik as 74.5%. Let us stick to rural India and fast forward to 2004-5. Nearly a decade and a half after the 1991 reforms. Pay attention to the 10th fractile. The average MPC for this group is 775 rupees and the average daily per head caloric intake is 2380 calories, slightly less than the RDA of 2400 calories. The actual value of MPC required to access the RDA as worked out by Patnaik is 800 rupees, slightly above the average of 775 rupees. Since the MPC values of all preceding fractiles is less than 800, the total number of rural poor would be between 80 and 90%. The actual value provided by Patnaik is 87% according to 2004-2005 survey, an increase of 12.5% since 1993-94. Let us now jump to 2009-10 and look at the figures from rural India once again. Here, for some reason, the NSS reports have arranged data in deciles. So instead of 12 fractiles, we have 10 deciles, each representing 10% of the population ranked by MPC. We can see from the data for the 9th decile that 1,329 rupees is the expenditure required to access 2,319 calories per head per day. And Patnaik's calculations based on this data throw up a figure of 1,550 rupees to access 2,400 calories. Which means that none of the bottom 9 deciles are spending enough to attain the RDA, and the total number of people to be counted as poor is just a little above 90%. Patnaik's estimate is 90.5%. In 2011-12, we see a sharp decline in the estimated number of poor for the first time since the economic reforms, with roughly 75% of the population unable to access 2,400 calories. That is my estimate, so it's probably a little off, give or take 1 or 2 percentage points. Whether this decline in the poverty ratio based on the nutritional norm method signifies a reversal of the trend observed since the 90s, which had shown it to be rising, or is an aberration, can only be figured out if we examine the next major NSS survey covering the year 2017-18. The problem is that the findings of that survey have sadly not been released because the government is concerned the underlying data is a bit dodgy. It's good to see that this government gives such importance to statistical rigor, otherwise people might start thinking that the reason the report has been shelved for now is that it is rumored to have shown an absolute decline in personal expenditure. But this government would never do that. It has never withheld official reports that show its performance in poor light, has it? Several explanations have been offered to explain the fall in rural poverty between 2009-10 and 2011-12, but going over them in detail will derail our current discussion, as whatever the reason may be, this much is clear, that even in 2011-12, the poverty ratio was at least as high as it was in 1993-94. Thus, the poverty ratio, or the proportion of the population that is unable to access the RDA for over 2 decades since the neoliberal reforms, show no decrease. In fact, for the bulk of this period, poverty based on nutritional norm increased significantly. We have worked out the data ourselves for rural areas, but the picture for urban India is pretty similar. We see that the urban poverty ratio increased sharply between 1993-94 and 2009-10, and in just 2 years decreased by nearly 30%. I want to reiterate that the 2011-12 values may be a bit off, but they're in the right ballpark, and the reversal of the trend of increasing poverty is valid, at least if one looks at the data. However, urban poverty still remains extremely high, with a little less than half the population unable to access the RDA of 2100 calories. Moreover, these estimates show a starkly different picture when compared to the claims made by successive governments, economists, and the media that poverty in India has reduced drastically in the period of the neoliberal reforms. Here we see the official estimates which show that by 2009-10, poverty ratios in both rural and urban areas had reduced to about a fifth of the population. The NSS figures that we derived show that 90% of rural people and more than 70% of the urban population were not spending enough to attain their respective RDAs. The source of the divergence lies in the methodology of how official poverty ratios have been estimated since the 1980s. See, the first official poverty estimates were made in 1979 based on data for 1973-74, and here the nutritional norm was followed and a corresponding poverty line for rural and urban areas was calculated. It was Rs 49 in rural areas in 1973-74 as shown in the table. In every subsequent official poverty estimate, the poverty line was merely adjusted to account for inflation using a price index. That is, it was assumed that rupees 86 in 1983 could buy the same basket of goods, including enough food items to access the RDA, as rupees 49 in 1973-74. That's a methodological choice that people more learned than I could ever be have chosen to use. I'm not going to say they're wrong or stupid to use it, but there is a way to see if this methodology produces valid results. Let us for a second concern ourselves with the official poverty line for the year 1993-94. It is rupees 206 for rural areas. Remember, the official stance is that if a person's MPC is above 206, they can access 2400 calories, their RDA, and we can check that claim out because we already have the data for it. An MPC of rupees 206 would put a person between the 30 to 40 fractile, which is why the official rural poverty ratio for this year is 37%. But if we move just a couple of columns to the right, we can see that the average daily caloric intake for this fractile is only 1968 calories. Thus, at the official poverty line, a person would be able to access not more than 2000 calories, 400 calories or 16.6% less than the RDA of 2400 calories. The same is true of the official poverty line for 2004-5. Which at rupees 358 would only allow a person to access a little more than 1800 calories or 25% less than the RDA. For 2009-10, the official poverty line is rupees 557, which can access not more than 1750 calories or 27% less than the RDA for rural areas. It is clear that the claims of reduction in poverty over the last 3 decades have not been made based on an actual reduction in poverty, but rather by lowering the nutritional standard by which poverty is measured. The definition of poverty has been quietly changed from a fixed daily caloric intake to simply the original poverty line adjusted for inflation, and hence comparing official estimates over different periods is meaningless since the standard of poverty measurement is made progressively lower. No wonder then the results of the official methodology seriously underestimate the actual incidence of poverty based on the nutritional norm, which increased tremendously between 1993-94 and 2009-10. These are all India rural and urban poverty lines we are talking about. If we start looking at state level data, the ludicrousness of the official methodology becomes even more apparent. Take urban Delhi for instance. The NSS data tells us that in 2009-10, a resident of Delhi needed to spend rupees 5100 a month to access the RDA of 2100 calories. Only 8% of urban Delhi residents had monthly expenditure that was greater than rupees 5100, which means that nutritional norm-based poverty ratio in Delhi was a whopping 92%. The official poverty line in rupees, though, was just a fifth of the actual poverty line. It was only rupees 1040, and the caloric intake at this level of expenditure was a mere 1400 calories, which is not only 700 calories below the urban RDA, it is also less than the average per head per day caloric intake of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which stood at 1500 calories in 2005. That is the ridiculously low level of nutrition that the official methodology bases its poverty reduction claims on. All the economists in the media, the politicians, the corporate leaders, not to mention the upper middle class uncles, the foreign management school returnees and morons on the internet who celebrate the neoliberal reforms as the moment that ushered in a golden age of prosperity, all these people should go to Delhi and try living on 1100 rupees a month, just above the official poverty line. That's 36 rupees per day for all expenditures. You have to be able to cover food, clothes, fuel, transportation, health, education, everything on 36 rupees a day. People like us who spend more than 36 rupees by the time we even sit down to have breakfast in the morning, who spend more on subscriptions to streaming platforms than the entire monthly expenditure of a person who spend thousands of rupees on a single meal at fancy restaurants, these people will have you believe that a person living on 36 rupees a day is not really poor. Good then. Let them try to live on that amount and see how soon they collapse to the ground bawling like giant babies. Of course, we hear nothing about the farce that is the official poverty line in popular discourse and mainstream media. There has, however, been some academic debate over something related, something a little more difficult to hide, that India's average rural and urban caloric intakes have been falling since the neoliberal reforms. It was some 200 calories below the 1972 level in 2009-10 for rural areas. Some arguments have been made to explain this vexed question, and exploring these will help us understand if the decline in caloric intake is a sign of nutritional impoverishment or not. One explanation is that people are engaged in lesser manual labor today than they were before, and thus their requirement of calories is lower. The problem with this explanation is that it runs counter to the evidence we have from the advanced economies of the world. The level of strenuous manual labor is significantly lesser in developed countries than in India. Yet average daily caloric intake per head is extremely high for these countries. In 2005, it was more than 3,800 calories in the US, 3,400 in the UK, and 3,500 in France and Germany. In India, in the same year, the average was barely 2,000 calories. We don't even need to compare caloric intake across countries. We can compare it between different sections of the Indian population to see how absurd this argument is. Observed caloric intake rises with an increase in monthly expenditure, such that in 2011-12, the average caloric intake of the top 5% was double that of the bottom 5% of the population. No one in their right minds would claim that the top 5% of the population are engaged in really demanding manual labor, much more so than the bottom 5%. But hey, who knows, some rich folks may be working really hard at the gym. Ironically, the increase in the average caloric intake across all sections of the population seen in 2011-12 totally invalidates this view, as there was no sudden increase in the strenuous nature of work in a period of 2 years which led to people seeking out additional calories. Another explanation that is offered is that due to India's stellar economic growth in the post-reform period, people's real incomes have risen. As this happened, people are shifting away from cereals as their main source of calories to other high-value, less calorie-dense sources of energy like animal and dairy products, fruits and nuts, etc. The argument is that people are substituting quantity for quality, or cheaper calories for costlier ones. The decline in the national average caloric intake is, according to this line of reasoning, not a sign of poverty, but rather a result of diversification of diets due to growing prosperity. There's a couple of things to unravel here. First, yes, there has been a slow increase in real monthly expenditures even at the lower end of the MPC distribution, and one can assume that is on account of an increase in incomes. But this has not been accompanied by an increase in expenditure on food in real terms. In their 2012 paper, Basu and Basol point out that real expenditure on food in 1993-94 for the entire rural population was 101.05 rupees, while in 2009-10 it was marginally lower at 100.7 rupees. These figures are in 1987-88 prices, that is, the amount of average food expenditure for both years has been deflated using the Consumer Price Index for agricultural laborers, so the numbers are directly comparable. Like I said, these are average figures for all of the rural population. If one disaggregates based on MPCE, we can see real expenditure on food actually falling for the bottom 5 deciles between 1993-94 and 2004-5, and then increasing slightly in 2009-10. But in all cases, it stayed either the same or marginally lower than the 1993-94 level. So the idea that poor people are diversifying their diets because they have more disposable income to spend on expensive food items is a misreading of the trends. In fact, as noted by Ghosh and Kadir in their 2017 paper, NSS data shows that for a fixed real MPCE, decrease in caloric intake has been due to a fall in consumption of both cereals and high-value foods in the neoliberal period. They conclude that, quote, the evidence negates the proposition that people are substituting quantity for quality or cheap calories for costlier ones. For the majority of the population, total calorie intake decline at a given MPCE has been accompanied by a corresponding decline in their intakes of both basic and high-value foods, with a declining share of high-value food calories in total calorie intake, indicating a deterioration in the quality of their diets. Protein intake has also declined in the neoliberal period, as is visible directly in the NSS reports. Ghosh and Kadir go on to state that, quote, the reduction in quantity consumption of high-value foods, and other food groups as well for that matter, indicates that micronutrients intake has also declined. Oils and fats are the sole exception to this trend, but their intake still remains at a very low level for a significant proportion of the population. Increasing affluence, then, does not seem to be a correct characterization of such a situation. A more plausible characterization may be the one suggested by Basu and Basol in the above mentioned paper, which they term the food budget squeeze. Here's what that means. This table from the NSS report shows the percentage composition of consumer expenditure between 1993-94 and 2011-12, and it divides total expenditure into food and non-food expenditure. Focusing on the food expenditure for rural areas for now, one can see how expenditure on cereals has halved in 2 decades. However, there has been no significant increase in the percentage of expenditure devoted to high-value foods, which by the way also shows why the quality instead of quantity explanation is quite wrong. But more than that, one can see that over 2 decades, the percentage of food expenditure in total expenditure has gone down by nearly 15 points. Meanwhile, non-food expenditure has increased by the same amount. This is crucial in understanding the stagnant real food expenditure and the food budget squeeze. What has really happened since the reforms is that whatever slight increases in real expenditure and income the poorer sectors of the population have seen, those increases have been mostly channeled into non-food essentials. This means that the money left for food has remained the same and is increasingly providing access to fewer calories than before, such that they are worse off than before from a nutritional standpoint. This channeling of expenditure to non-food categories is really not due to a shift in preferences or tastes. It is largely driven by the fact that the neoliberal reforms initiated a retreat of the state from the public provisioning of education, healthcare, subsidized housing and transportation, and other social services. In the above table, the largest component of non-food expenditure is the miscellaneous goods and services, which increased by 50% from 17.3 to 26.1% in 2 decades. In this table, we see the breakdown of different components within the miscellaneous goods and services category of non-food expenditure, which contains the non-food essentials we're talking about. As is visible, expenditures on education, medical care, transportation in rural and urban areas, and rent in urban areas have all increased, as the support of state-subsidized services has been replaced by private profit-maximizing entities. Through modeling, Basu and Basol found that an increase of 1% expenditure on non-food essentials is associated with a 1% decline in average calorie intake. They point out that such a negative correlation between non-food expenditure and caloric intake is quite unusual because income growth and a fall in the real price of food can ensure that even a lower share of household expenditure devoted to food is enough to secure an increasing or at least constant calorie intake. Therefore, they write, when an increase in the share of non-food essential expenditure leads to a decline in calorie intake, it is a perverse outcome, one that we wish to denote as a food budget squeeze, with an emphasis on the term squeeze. Since our results consistently show a negative and statistically significant coefficient on non-food essentials, we can conclude that the food budget squeeze effect is indeed strong and remains in operation even after we have controlled for real expenditure growth, diversification, and possible changes in calorie needs. Of course, there will be those who will object to our analysis by saying that the nutritional norm of measuring poverty is outdated, that the calorie norms are too high, that human development indicators show India is doing much better. Okay, we can argue about those things, but the point is that the claims of poverty reduction have been made based on the nutritional norm, and we have seen how they have been debauched to support the idea of growing prosperity in neoliberal India. We're not debating the merits of the nutritional norm. We are bringing to light their malicious usage. On that charge, I believe there is no plausible defense. I want to end by making 2 claims, one weak and one strong. Let me start with the weak one. The discussion in this video should at the very least make one question the received wisdom popularized by the serious gentleman I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that the cure for India's economic woes lies in going further down the neoliberal road. As we've seen, it is aspects of the neoliberal reforms, including the cuts to state spending, that has left rural India in a ruinous mess, while also increasing the cost of accessing food, healthcare, education, and transportation. That is a problem that cannot be solved by further cuts in state spending, by further privatization and commercialization. We must also remember that the deterioration of nutritional standards and rise in the number of poor has occurred during a period of unprecedented high growth for the Indian economy, that is the mid-2000s. With investment growth slowing down since the beginning of this decade, external shocks to the informal economy due to demonetization and GST, and now the COVID-19 pandemic, the situation today is much worse for the bulk of the population than it was at the beginning of this decade, which was already pretty bad. On the other end of the spectrum, the top 10% of the population holds 77% of total national wealth, and in 2017, the top 1% cornered 73% of the wealth generated in that year. This contrast in the fates of a small minority at the top and the rest of the population, obscene luxury on the one hand and a sea of misery on the other, is not an accident. It is a result of conscious policy choices made by people in power. And that brings me to the second strong claim I wish to make, which is this. Neoliberal capitalism at this point in time is not so much an intellectually coherent ideology, but rather a glorified death cult, and our responsible, serious men are nothing but the high priests of this insane cult bent on world destruction. That's just my opinion. Every cult stands on its mythology, and in this video we have scrutinized one particular myth, that of poverty reduction. In subsequent episodes of the C Word, we will systematically deconstruct others. We will discuss the roots of agrarian distress, the trends in employment, the performance of India's manufacturing sector, and much more. I cannot say I have provided enough evidence in this video to convince you of this strong claim. By the time we're done though, I hope it will be pretty obvious.
We are building a religion, we are building it bigger. We are widening the corridors and adding more lanes. We are building a religion, a limited edition. We are now accepting collars for these pendant keychains. To resist it is useless, it is useless to resist it. His cigarette is burning, but he never seems to